All right, let's dive in. We're taking a deep dive today with Carl J. Strickwerda's book, The Origins of the Contemporary Global Order.
Sounds ambitious.
Oh, it is. But I think our listeners are up for it. They always are.
Yeah.
Trying to understand how the world we live in today came to be, well, this book is like a guidebook, almost, to understanding the 21st century.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And he doesn't start in the 20th century or even the 19th. He actually goes all the way back to the 1800s.
The 19th century, that's
Yeah.
right. Strickwerda calls it the first era of globalization. Now, you might think of globalization as something modern, but in this book, well, he paints this really vivid picture of a world that was already amazingly interconnected back then. Like he even uses the example of his own grandfather.
Oh, yeah, the Dutch carpenter.
Yeah, the Dutch carpenter, who traveled across the Atlantic multiple times for work. Can you imagine?
It's pretty incredible when you think about it.
Yeah, that kind of global mobility. I mean, that was pretty rare back then, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it really highlights the incredible scale of things happening during that period. I mean, you had this enormous economic growth, trade, and migration happening. People forget or just don't know how much was going on back then.
Yeah, it's easy to think of the 19th century as this sort of, sleepy time before the modern world. But
Right, but it was actually really dynamic, and Strickwerda argues that it was all driven by a couple of big things, industrialization, obviously, but then also this relatively stable global order built on a balance of power in Europe.
So explain this balance of power thing. How did that work? It sounds kind of precarious.
Yeah, well, essentially it meant that no single nation could totally dominate Europe. It was like they were all kind of keeping each other in check.
Oh, great.
And that actually led to a period of relative peace, believe it or not. It allowed for economic growth and global trade to flourish. But
Well, here's where things get a bit more complex. This whole era of globalization, well, it wasn't all positive. Strickwerda really doesn't shy away from the darker side of things. Yeah, it's definitely not all sunshine and roses.
Yeah.
He makes it clear that this whole period of globalization was also really closely tied to European imperialism. And of course, imperialism had some really devastating consequences, especially in Africa and Asia.
exactly. You can't talk about 19th century globalization without talking about colonialism and its impacts. I mean, it's impossible to separate the two.
So I'm curious, does Strickwerda suggest that globalization and exploitation are, like, inherently linked?
That's a tough question. It's definitely something he grapples with in the book. I mean, on the one hand, he acknowledges the obvious harm caused by imperialism, but he also argues that the same forces that drove all this progress, things like industrialization, trade, even migration, well, they also fueled things like nationalism, imperialism, and militarism. And eventually, those forces started to really undermine the 19th century order.
It's like the seeds of its own destruction were sown right there in the foundation.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And those seeds really start to sprout as we move into the 20th century.
Yeah, things really start to unravel. We see the rise of all these populist movements,
Yeah.
clashing ambitions between the great powers. It's like the world is teetering on the edge of something.
Right, and this is where Strickwerda's analysis of Germany gets really interesting. He argues that Germany, even though it was this economic powerhouse, made some pretty big miscalculations on the world stage.
Really? How so?
Well, they had this ambition for dominance, in this increasingly interconnected world, and well, that led them into a war they just couldn't win. A war that changed everything.
World War I. And it wasn't just some regional conflict.
No. This was a global war in every sense.
It is a global war that completely shook the foundations of the world. Empires crumbled, millions of people died. And these new technologies, like the machine gun, well, they changed the face of warfare forever.
Yeah, and it was a war that, in many ways, was driven by this clash of global visions. I mean, on the one hand, you had Germany, who was trying to reshape the global economic order, trying to challenge Britain's dominance. And what's really crucial here, I mean, Strickwerda argues that for the first time, victory in this new kind of industrial warfare, well, it depended on controlling global resources and supply chains.
Whoa, that's a chilling thought. And it feels, so relevant to even today. It's like
Right.
the battle lines weren't just in the trenches anymore. They stretched across factories and ports, across the entire global trade network.
Exactly.
So the war ends, but the world is in chaos. What happens next?
Well, the victors, they're trying to rebuild. They want to establish a lasting peace. And, well, they draft the Treaty of Versailles. But, as Strickwerda points out, well, the treaty was really flawed.
Okay, flawed how? In what way?
Well, instead of creating a truly new order, they kind of tried to just reinstate the pre-war world, you know? They even brought back the gold standard, and, well, that ended up backfiring spectacularly. Instead of creating stability, it actually contributed to even more economic instability.
So instead of building on solid ground, it's like they were trying to rebuild on quicksand.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And of course, this instability, this uncertainty, it led directly to the Great Depression.
And the Great Depression, of course, swept across the entire globe.
Right. And the economic hardship, the social unrest, well, it created this breeding ground for extremism.
It's scary how quickly a desire for stability can turn into something so dark.
Absolutely. And of course, this extremism, well, it took root in several places, but most notably in Germany and Japan.
Right, right.
And Strickwerda argues that the dictatorships that emerged in those countries, well, they were fueled by this resentment over the treaty, this thirst for revenge. So instead of embracing international cooperation, they turned towards this aggressive expansionism. And while Strickwerda makes a really strong case that World War II, well, it was a direct consequence of all those unresolved issues from World War I.
So it's like a wound that never healed.
Exactly, and it just festered until, well, until it erupted again, even more devastatingly than before.
So the world is plunged into another fight for global dominance, but, well, this time there's a new player on the field, the United States.
Yes, and this is a pivotal shift. The Allied victory, with the U.S. playing a key role. Well, it sets the stage for a brand new global order, one that was largely shaped by American power and, of course, vision. It was a period of intense institution building, you know?
I mean, think about it. The Marshall Plan, NATO, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods system. I mean, so many of the institutions we rely on today emerged from the ashes of World War II.
It's really remarkable. And Strickwerda's point is that all these institutions, while definitely imperfect, represented a real effort to learn from the mistakes of the past. You know, they were trying to build a more stable and cooperative world.
But I imagine it wasn't as simple as the U.S. just dictating its own terms to the rest of the world, right?
Yeah. You're right. It wasn't that simple. The U.S. had a lot of influence, obviously, but they also had to adapt to the realities of a world that was increasingly divided by the Cold War.
So what emerged was a mix of American idealism and pragmatism.
Exactly. They had to address the concerns of their allies, many of whom were pretty wary of unchecked American power.
Right.
And so we see this move towards a more managed world economy and a growing emphasis on regional integration, particularly in Europe.
Fascinating. So they were trying to walk this tightrope between promoting global cooperation and at the same time addressing the specific needs and anxieties of different regions.
Right, and that's a tension that we still see playing out today.
So how does Strickwerda connect all of this to the challenges we face in the 21st century? I mean, does this post-war order still hold up?
That's what we'll explore next. He argues that understanding the historical roots of this global order is key to navigating the complexities of today's world. We'll dig into all of that after a short break.
We were talking about how this post-World War II order, with all its institutions and compromises, was trying to create a more stable world. But I'm guessing there were still a lot of tensions simmering beneath the surface, right?
Oh, absolutely. Strickwerda really emphasizes that point. You know, the post-war period, sure, there was a lot of cooperation going on, but it was also deeply shaped by the Cold War rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. I mean, that ideological clash had a huge impact on pretty much everything: global politics, economics, you name it.
It's like this shadow looming over everything. And it wasn't just a battle of ideas either, right? I mean, there were real-world consequences. Proxy wars, the constant fear of nuclear annihilation.
Absolutely. The stakes were incredibly high. But even amidst all that tension, there was also this remarkable period of institution building and economic recovery, particularly in Western Europe. Think about the Marshall Plan, for instance.
Oh, yeah, the Marshall Plan. That was a massive aid program, right?
Yeah.
The U.S. pumped billions of dollars into rebuilding war-torn European economies.
Exactly. And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it seems almost counterintuitive, right? Helping your former enemies recover so quickly after such a devastating war. Why was the U.S. so invested in European recovery?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, were they just being altruistic?
Well, Strickwerda argues that it was partly about containing Soviet influence, of course, but it was also about genuine humanitarian concern and this belief in the importance of economic interdependence. A strong Europe, the thinking went, would be a more stable and prosperous partner for the U.S.
So a mix of strategic self-interest and a kind of idealistic vision for a more interconnected world.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And this blend of idealism and pragmatism, you see it again in the creation of the United Nations. I mean, here's this incredibly ambitious attempt to create a forum for global dialogue and conflict resolution.
Right, the UN. But it's always been criticized, hasn't it, for being bureaucratic, ineffective in preventing conflicts. Does Strickwerda address those criticisms?
He does. He acknowledges the UN's shortcomings, for sure. But he also argues that it's played a vital role in promoting international cooperation, particularly in areas like humanitarian aid and development. And he emphasizes that it represents, at the very least, an aspiration towards a more peaceful world order.
It's interesting to think about how those early aspirations have played out over time. I guess it's inevitable that any global organization like that is going to face challenges and setbacks, right?
Yeah, for sure. No institution is perfect.
Yeah.
But what about the economic side of things? We talked earlier about how the gold standard backfired so badly after World War I. Did the post-war order try something different?
Yeah, that's a good question. They must have learned something from that experience, right?
They did. Strickweres explains how the Bretton Woods system, which was established in 1944, created a whole new global financial order. It was designed to stabilize currencies and promote international trade. And it actually worked pretty well for a while, playing a key role in the economic boom of the post-war era.
So this time, instead of trying to restore the pre-war economic order, they actually tried something new.
Yeah, exactly. They learned from the mistakes of the past and created a system that, while not perfect, proved to be much more adaptable and resilient. But it's important to remember that this post-war order wasn't just a product of American vision. It was also the result of a lot of negotiations and compromises between many different nations.
So the U.S. wasn't just calling all the shots.
Not entirely. I mean, the U.S. had significant influence, of course, but they also had to take into account the interests and concerns of their allies. And within this emerging order, regional integration played a crucial role. The formation of the European Economic Community, which later became the European Union, is a great example of that.
Right, the EU. It's interesting to think about how that project, which started as an economic partnership, has evolved into something much more politically integrated over time.
Absolutely. And Strickwerda points out that regional integration, whether it's in Europe or elsewhere, can be a really powerful force for stability and cooperation. It allows countries to address shared challenges, pool their resources, and it can even act as a counterweight to great power rivalry.
So if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture here, we see this post-World War II order that's shaped by both cooperation and competition, by American leadership, but also by the needs and interests of other nations. It's a pretty complex and multifaceted system.
But how does Strickwerda connect all of this to the challenges we face today?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And to understand that connection, we need to look at some of the major developments that have reshaped the global landscape in recent decades. One of the most significant, of course, is the rise of China.
The rise of China. It's something we hear about constantly in the news, but often it feels like it's presented as this totally new phenomena. Does Strickwerda frame it differently? He does. He argues that while China's economic and military power has grown dramatically in recent years, its reemergence as a major global player can also be seen as a continuation of its historical role. For centuries, China was a major center of power and influence, and in many ways, it's simply reclaiming its place on the world stage.
That's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah.
It reminds us that history isn't linear. It often circles back on itself, revisiting old patterns in new contexts.
Exactly. And Strickwerda challenges us to see beyond the headlines and recognize the deeper historical forces at play. For instance, he argues that the current tensions between the US and China, while definitely concerning, aren't entirely unprecedented. Throughout history, rising powers have often challenged the existing order, and that's often led to periods of instability and conflict.
It's like this age-old dance between established powers and those seeking to reshape the global landscape. But does Strickwerda believe that conflict between the U.S. and China is inevitable? Is that where we're headed?
He doesn't say that explicitly, but he does caution against these simplistic narratives that frame the relationship solely in terms of rivalry and conflict, like it's a zero-sum game. He argues that there's also potential for cooperation, particularly on issues like climate change and global trade.
So it's not a foregone conclusion that we're headed for a new Cold War.
Not necessarily. But Strickwerda emphasizes that the choices made by both countries in the coming years will be absolutely crucial in shaping the future of the global order. And this is where understanding history becomes so important. By recognizing the patterns of the past, we can hopefully avoid repeating the same mistakes.
It's like having a roadmap, but not necessarily a set of directions. We still have to choose our own path.
Precisely. And that choice requires careful consideration, a deep understanding of the forces at play, and a willingness to learn from both the successes and the failures of the past. But beyond the rise of China, there are other challenges to the contemporary global order that Strickwerda explores.
So what else is shaking things up in the 21st century? What else should we be paying attention to?
Well, one trend we can't ignore is the rise of populism and nationalism, and not just in the US, but in many parts of the world. It's a global phenomenon.
This seems like a direct challenge to the whole idea of global cooperation and integration.
Yeah.
And it feels very familiar, almost like an echo of the interwar period.
We're picking up on a key point that Strickwerda makes. He argues that the current wave of populism, with its skepticism of global institutions and emphasis on national sovereignty, well, it has some pretty clear parallels to the political trends that led to the breakdown of the global order in the 1930s.
So are we heading down a similar path? Are we destined to repeat the mistakes of the past?
Strickwerda doesn't believe in historical determinism. He doesn't think we're simply doomed to repeat past errors. But he does argue that understanding the historical context of these trends is essential for navigating them effectively.
So what's the key takeaway here? How can we apply these historical insights to the challenges we face today?
Well, one important lesson is that global cooperation is fragile. It requires constant attention and effort. It's not something we can just take for granted. We need to actively work to strengthen the institutions that support it and find ways to address the legitimate concerns of those who feel left behind by globalization.
It sounds like a daunting task, especially in a world that often feels so divided and polarized. But I guess understanding the historical context can give us a sense of perspective, maybe even some hope. We've seen how humans have managed to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges in the past.
That's right. And Strickwerda reminds us that history is full of examples of human resilience, ingenuity, and cooperation. We faced dark times before, and we found a way through. The key, he argues, is to learn from those experiences, both the triumphs and the tragedies, and to use that knowledge to build a more just and sustainable future.
So amidst all this complexity, there's still room for optimism.
I believe there is. But it's not a naive optimism. It's an optimism grounded in a deep understanding of the forces that shape our world and a commitment to working together to address the challenges we face.
I appreciate that perspective. It feels like a call to action, a reminder that we're not just passive observers of history, but active participants in shaping the future. We've covered a lot of ground in our exploration of Strickwerda's book, from the interconnectedness of the 19th century to the rise of new global powers in the 21st. And I'm curious to hear what final thoughts he leaves us with. We'll be back in a moment to wrap up our deep dive into the origins of the contemporary global order. We're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Carl J. Strickwerda's The Origins of the Contemporary Global Order. You know, it's been a really fascinating journey, tracing the evolution of, well, everything from the 19th century all the way to today, and I'm really curious to hear how Strickwerda brings it all together in his conclusion.
You know, one thing that really stood out to me in his conclusion was his emphasis on the importance of historical perspective. He argues that, understanding the past, it's not just about memorizing names and dates. It's really about developing this deeper understanding of the forces that have shaped the world we live in.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, we've seen throughout this deep dive how events that might seem, distant or disconnected actually have a huge impact on the present.
Exactly. And Strickwerda reminds us that, the choices we make today, they're shaped by the decisions of those who came before us. He argues that by studying history, we can really gain these crucial insights into the patterns of human behavior, the consequences of our actions, and hopefully the possibilities for creating a better future.
So it's not just about looking back. It's about using that knowledge to inform our actions in the present.
Yes. Precisely. He's challenging us to become active participants in shaping the future, not just passive observers of history. He argues that we all have a responsibility to engage with the world around us, to try to understand all its complexities, and to work towards a more just and sustainable global order.
That's a really powerful message. But I imagine, for some listeners, it might also feel a bit overwhelming. I mean, the scale of these global challenges. Yeah. What advice does Strickwerda offer for folks who want to make a difference but aren't really sure where to start?
Well, he really stresses the importance of education and critical thinking. He encourages us to read widely, to engage with diverse perspectives, and to really challenge our own assumptions. The more informed we are about the world, the better equipped we'll be to make, thoughtful decisions and contribute to positive change.
So it's about being a lifelong learner, constantly seeking out new knowledge, and challenging our own biases.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's not just about, acquiring knowledge for the sake of it. It's about applying it, putting it into practice. He encourages us to find ways to use our skills, talents, and passions to address the issues that we care about, whether it's through our careers or activism or even just our everyday choices.
I love that. It's
Ye-
so empowering. It reminds us that we all have agency, that we can make a difference, even if it's in small ways.
Yeah, I agree. And he emphasizes that collective action is crucial. He argues that we need to work together to build bridges across divides, to strengthen the institutions that support global cooperation, and to, find common ground on issues of shared concern.
It's a good reminder that we're not alone in facing these challenges. We're all part of a global community. Our fates are interconnected.
That's right. And Strickwerda argues that recognizing that interconnectedness is really essential for building a more just and sustainable world. He challenges us to move beyond, narrow self-interest and to embrace a more expansive vision of human solidarity.
That's such a powerful idea. It reminds us that our actions have consequences that go way beyond ourselves,
Mm,
and that we have a responsibility to consider the well-being of others, both now and in the future.
I agree. It's a really important point.
I think that's a great takeaway from our deep dive into Strickwerda's book.
Mhm.
He leaves us with this sense of, I don't know, both urgency and hope, right? The challenges are real, they're significant, but so is our capacity for innovation, cooperation, and resilience.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
It's a great reminder that the future isn't set in stone. It's something that we create together through our choices and our actions and our commitment to building a better world. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to thank you for joining us on this journey through history. I hope you found it as thought-provoking as I have.
It's been a pleasure, and I really hope this deep dive has inspired you to continue exploring the forces that shape our world and to, find ways to contribute to a more just and sustainable future.
That's all for our deep dive today, folks. Thanks for listening.